Hello guys, this is our last topic in this course. And today we're going to talk about modernity, right? I know this subject is supposed to be about history, but history is being done as we speak all around us. So it is interesting that in the case of cross-culture encounters, we've been talking about how Europeans have been affecting others, or Americans, or Japanese, or everyone else when they go to the other countries, and what happens then. What happens when someone else from other cultures comes to your country or your set of countries? And Europe here is one of the greatest examples that we're going to talk about today. Um, it is nowadays, Europe particularly, is nowadays in the midst of a multicultural revolution. Immigrants from all over the globe have flooded that subcontinent since World War II. That has been happening annually. The arrival of these immigrants has been perceived as so explosive that it has produced counter-movements expressed by the need on the part of many peoples, indigenous and immigrants, to reaffirm their cultural identities, whatever those are, and to set the culture boundaries that would set them apart from the other cultures and nations. The rising tension between the multicultural world community and movements to assert essential cultural values has turned to Western Europe, which was previously the land of prosperity, peace, and great existence in general. It turned it into a contested, quite conflictual grounds that suggest that conflicts and compromises that will become increasingly prevalent throughout the globalizing world. Modern Europe is sort of a battlefield today, but not between the actual armies or combatants. It's more about the battlefield of certain ideas fighting one another, between cosmopolitanism and conservative nationalism, to be precise. Right now, Europe is experiencing tremendous immigration from areas that surround it, mainly from Northern Africa, also from the Balkans, Turkey, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. This influx is at historically high levels, not just because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It has been happening for decades already. About 2 million immigrants have entered Europe annually since 2003, right? Before most of the wars, either in Middle East or in Eastern Europe, have happened. And in 2016, the rates have gone way up. Berlin now has the third largest Turkish population in the world, right? So that basically that means that there are only two cities in the world that have more Turks in Turkey than Berlin, right? Berlin and Germany. This immigration and this rate of immigration started in the post-World War II economic boom, when European leaders invited immigrants to settle in Europe and fill out a thin labor pool because of the war. After the recession in the 1970s, because nobody can grow constantly forever, many European countries had decided to stop actively bringing in new migrants. But by that time, the flow of immigrants who are attracted to the high standards of living in Europe and just generally by the European culture and sophisticated environment that has been rebuilt. And most of them have come from countries with unstable political situation or other countries that were embroiled in violence. So basically, for them, um, Europe in crisis was still a lot more preferable than life back home. Um, This is just an image of how modern immigration to Europe happens. On the boat, right? I just want to explain what we're seeing here on the boat. These people are definitely not very happy, particularly because of this gentleman over there. The gentleman is not there to guard them, not to guard their safety at least. It's a coast guard, it's a border patrol that has caught a boat with illegal immigrants, most of whom are black, coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Um, every and each one of them. And you can see with these people, not all of them are wearing life vests, right? Some of them are with kids, and none of them are happy because all of them have paid a significant amount of money to get on this boat. Typically, that sort of boat for each person would ask from, for anything from 3,000 euros up to 10,000 euros, depending on the deal that you get. The more you pay, the more you get. So like a life vest here, for instance, is something that you have to buy, right? Why are the life vests important? Because if you look at this, I don't even want to call it a boat. It's like a barcass or something, um, floating something, right? Um, if you look at it, it is definitely not safe, right? It is definitely not safe to cross the sea, and people drown. Quite often, a lot of people who try to cross onto the European Union by sea, they drown, including children. Um, so yeah, they're not very happy because they've paid so much money to get to Europe, and basically they're busted. This guy is somebody who will make sure, because they haven't reached the territory of any European country, that they go back, right? So that money is gone. You're not in Europe. You start over. Why does it happen that so many people all of a sudden want to risk their lives to get to Europe, right? What is what is so appealing to them? Why? Well, answers are very clear. There's a huge gap between the rich and the poor countries today. No matter how problematic we find contemporary European economies, they're still going to be infinitely better than an economy somewhere in Uganda, for instance. A high level of instability in the rest of the world also contributes. The more unstable the world is, and especially the troubled areas of the world are, the more people from those territories want to go somewhere else where life is a little more stable and there's a lot more security. Economic issues in many places of the world are also very extreme, making it a problem of survival. It's not about earning more money all of a sudden. It's about surviving, right? When you don't have any income, when you live on $1 a day or less, then it's not about you being um, greedy when you go to European Union or any other country when you try to flee that horrible uh, those horrible circumstances. No, you want to survive, right? High level of social policy in European countries is also something that helps quite a lot with attracting those migrants because when they look at the things that are already considered to be normal in Europe, social welfare, for instance, and they look at unemployment benefits. A lot of people in those countries are like, wait, so their unemployment benefits are a lot higher than any kind of pay I'm going to receive, no matter how hard I will try to build my career locally, right? So for a lot of them, it seems to be a very appealing um, a very appealing opportunity, something that is almost too good to pass. Of course, they don't consider a lot of factors alongside with that, which we're going to talk a little bit later in more detail. But still, right? They look at it, and it seems to be too appealing. Military conflicts are also happening, and starting to happen much more often, specifically in the troubled areas of Africa, Middle East, and now East Europe, right, where um, a lot more refugees come from. International law also acknowledges the rights of refugees and internally displaced people, which also sort of provides them with a framework and idea that, well, we're gonna go there, people are gonna take care of us, because international law is on our side. This is a slightly different group of people. There's fundamental difference between these two pictures. Look at this woman throughout the classes from different from time to time some people would be like, oh no, she's crying, then another group of people would be, oh no, she's laughing, right? So regardless, I would be personally considering her laughing or smiling at least. The reason why these people are infinitely happier than those other ones in the picture number one is that they are on the shore, right? So they've come to shore. um, that means they have succeeded with at least the first stage of their plan. They already entered the European Union. They're going to claim that they're refugees and asylum seekers, and nobody will send them back, at least immediately. Then the new hardships begin. They would have to go onto the immigration count. Over there, they will wait for the court, right, for the court hearing. That can happen anything from several months away or maybe years away, right? So for them, all this time they'll have to live in those immigration facilities, which are quite oftenly under-equipped. They're not great in terms of the quality of life there, and they're quite dangerous in general. As an environment that's quite a dangerous environment with a lot of conflicts, with a lot of suicide rates, with a lot of violent crimes happening, rapes and etc. and there they'll have to come, somehow exist until the court hears their case and either allows them to stay, gives them the papers, or sends them back. Um, Originally, the migrants would be young men who came to fulfill the thin labor pool, right, to replenish the working hands that were in such need. And they often came temporarily, meaning that they're going to earn money, save up while they're in Europe, bring that money home, and be rich, right? Get a capital that will then give you an opportunity to live happily ever after in your home country. But with the gap between rich and poor countries widening, entire families started to have to come to Europe for permanent stay, changing the nature of the immigration structure, right? Because if there was, young people that will go, that's not a problem, right? If they go, that's not a problem. They're helping us, we're giving them money, that's it. But as soon as they start relocating for good, this is where the cultural tensions appear. Immigrants from the same country tend to typically settle close to one another because that just is how we are hardwired. We try to stick to the people who are like us, um, and they try to retain connections to their home countries as much as possible as well, all of which is not really good for adaptation and assimilation. If anybody would to adapt and assimilate better is when a person willingly just severs the ties with family, people. Well, no, it doesn't have to be family, but I mean, when there's not a lot of ties to people back there, or also to your own community where you can just speak your own language, not get any friends of the locals, or master the local language, be it English, French, or whatever. Um, then the relocation would be a lot more efficient, and the person would blend in and assimilate in a lot more sophisticated manner. Many immigrants are impoverished in Europe, and that is one of the problems with their existence in Europe, because they go there hoping that it's everybody's rich there. And yes, by the standards of, let's say, Libya, for instance, or be it Iraq or any sub-Saharan African country, 1,000 euros is it's quite a lot. 2,000 euros, great, right? But the standards of European countries, it's definitely not a lot. And if you only have 1,000 euro per month, you're basically poor, right? So that's a certain difference. However, these people are ready to live in totally different conditions compared to normal Europeans, ordinary local Europeans. So for them, it's still is at least perceived to be a lot of a much better deal than it would seem to anyone else. Um, so they're quite often impoverished in Europe, but in their home countries, they're thought to be wealthy and successful. Many of you will probably know, because some of you guys have relatives in Europe and mostly in the United States of America. And then older generation will be like, oh, he's successful because he lives in US now, right? Assuming that it's somehow automatic win, but it's really not. Some immigrants will go far to impress their family back home and to reinforce that image of foreign success. They would, with Turkish immigrants, right? With Turkish immigrants, it's a common practice. In Belgium, they would borrow money to buy an expensive car like a Mercedes. They would drive it to Turkey to impress their relatives with their success and riches, and then sell the car when they return to Europe, and then they'd be paying the debt for the country that they don't sorry, not the country, for the car that they don't have anymore, and also to compensate for the things that they've spent lavishly in their home country, and all of that just to impress your family. Um, Now, this map represents the percent of overall Muslim population in each country. Just keep in mind, Muslim population doesn't mean that all of them are particularly immigrants, right? That they're refugees. Some of them are naturally born there, or second or third generation. Um, the overall population is listed here, so you can calculate how many Muslims have been there in European countries at the 2018. And let me tell you, the ratio has not really changed much since then. This is something that proves uh, this is something that proves that a very important point, because a lot of the people who would be on the anti-migrant spectrum, right, would be having extreme anti-migrant positions. They would say, Well, European is undergoing Islamization, right? The Muslims are capturing Europe, they're making it their own land, etc., etc. Well, I don't think that 6% of Muslim people is going to be anything close to, achieving Islamization or anything like that. That's a minority. It's not big. Of course, it's more than probably it used to be 50 or 60 years ago, but it's definitely not big. So that's a faulty argument. That is simply there to appeal to a very basic emotion, fear, right? Fear and xenophobia. If we also look at the percent, right, the percentage, most of the countries have similar comparable percentages, especially according to their, with their population. Uh, Spain and Italy right now have more because the European Union has basically decided that these two countries are going to be accountable for most of the refugees today. Because they, previously people entered through Spain and Italy, before that Greece, but that was closed after a deal with Turkey. They entered through these countries and they went to Germany, Denmark, United Kingdom, Northern European countries like Sweden, and none of them stayed there. But after a certain point, European Union adopted another strategy that suggested that you can only be given asylum and you can only live in the country that you first enter. That kind of severs away France, Germany, and the rest of those countries that have been the primary attraction points. So most of the immigrants right now, the refugees, they have to stay in Italy and Spain most of all. In Europe, with its traditionally low birth rates, immigration is an important solution to the dwindling labor pool because if you don't attract migrants when you have that level of fertility rates, you guys are going to be just like Japan. Japan or Korea that are horrible in terms of their demography. And okay, Korea is, I mean, they have experience with bringing in migrants, but Japan, that is very anti-migrant and very nationalistic, is one of the worst examples is what can happen to your society when you have so many old people unable to work anymore that need the support of the government and very few young people who cannot support that sort of economy. So Spain, Italy, and Greece are all below 1.5 births per female because it takes 2.1 children per family to maintain the current birth rate and the current population level. The number of young people in Europe has fallen, and the population of Europe is shrinking and aging rapidly. It is estimated that about 500,000 new immigrants per year will be needed in Germany alone to maintain the age balance there. 500,000 immigrants, right? So one fourth of Tashkent, right, is needed yearly to keep Germany afloat in terms of its population. Since Europe needs more people to fill out its workforce, one might assume that the Europeans would be saying, yes, please come to our countries, please help us replenish the um, our demography, help us work, help us vitalize our economy, because they would need to fill out the population void, which has very specific economic consequences. But the reality of the immigration scene in Europe is much more complicated. Immigrants who cannot find jobs are a norm. It's quite rarely that immigrants are able to easily integrate and find jobs and assimilate. Quite often, they are in search of jobs. Even if they're in search of jobs, they're quite constantly being discriminated. There's been a lot of research, especially in France, where independent journalists would compare the approval rate for a CV that has two absolutely identical CVs for non-existing people. They're made up, but they have great CVs. One is has a name of Emmanuel, and another one is to the person that's allegedly called Muhammad. So guess what CV is getting approved more often? Obviously, the one with the French name, and the guy named Muhammad keeps getting shafted and has a very low acceptance rate wherever he applies for a job. Um, and what happens when people are unemployed? There's people that are supposed to help economically. Europeans themselves have created and kind of reinforced that situation, that environment where those people cannot participate in development of that economy. What happens then? These people who are supposed to help become a burden, an excessive burden on the welfare system of the European states. Um, and again, they require money to be spent on them, and they don't exactly put that money back into the economy with their own labor. In addition, with immigrants has come the fear on the part of Western Europeans of being overwhelmed by them, specifically of being taken over by Muslims, since it's a different religion, very distinct religion compared to the rest of Europe that's typically Christian, some of it Catholic, um, but none of it is extremely religious. Unless, if we talk about more conservative Poland and um, Hungary. But most of the Europe is already quite secular, so even on the side of Christians, they're not as much of a dominant force. Those are secular countries that have very particular stance on religion. This was an improvised immigration camp, and back in the day, um, people were actually feeling when all of this becoming a problem. The refugee crisis was just appearing as something new and unresolved and unstudied. Um, People weren't exactly anti-Muslim all of a sudden, right? There was no, people weren't afraid of this culture war, weren't afraid of Islamization or anything like that. They're actually willing to help these people. Their initial reaction, this is a, I'm not mistaken, that's a railway station in Berlin, and their initial reaction was, help. Let's help them. Let's bring diapers for the kids, toys for the kids, warm clothes because most of them come without any warm clothes, and it's already, getting sort of cold. And in Germany, it can get quite cold. The weather is not exactly Syria over there, right? So, uh, yeah, help was the first reaction to the people in trouble. But then people kept coming and coming, and their initial reaction had been changing, especially with the influence of modern media that had been propelling negative connotation to those migrants and what has been happening around migration. In the earlier stage, single male immigration, European single male immigration, the cultural values of the immigrants were not an issue because they were going home. Who cares what they believe in, as long as they don't breed trouble immediately when they're here, and whatever. Go home, be whoever you want over there. The permanent residence of immigrant families, however, changes that because their beliefs, their behavior in the society, within these societies, sometimes becomes a center of conflict, and the clash of cultural values happens from time to time um, in the Europeans and immigrant communities. That's become a flashpoint, drawing much attention in the world's media. To argue that this is a clash between East and West, or between Christian and Muslim civilizations, is basically to severely oversimplify what is happening in Europe, because much greater complexity of these encounters needs to be analyzed more closely to fully understand the situation. For example, again, the newspaper would typically imagine you are the head of the newspaper and you have to pick one story for the front page so your paper sells, so you get money, you don't become poor and homeless, right? And you don't lose your job. What will you choose? A German man rapes a German woman, or a Syrian refugee male, right, rapes a German woman. Which one would attract a lot more people, a lot more views, a lot more comments, and would basically do what you need to do as a newspaper and as a media, right? Attract views. You know which one that is, right? This is why the media have been prioritizing immigrant related issues and tensions and conflicts and crime, and while the rest, which is done by the majority of the population, goes to some extent unnoticed. Uh, an opinion poll, right? That's an interesting opinion poll about the attitude towards the people of Iraq and Syria that are relocating to Europe. Do you believe, right? The question is, do you believe that these people of Iraq and Syria are a major threat to your country? And then most of the countries in Europe would be feeling quite tolerant, right? Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden were the most, financially well-off countries of the European Union would be like, no, not a problem. Their well-being is quite high. They're quite confident that they can take it, and they don't see particularly any potential issues. UK, France, and Spain not as developed, of course, but UK and France are still quite good. But the percentage is closer to 50%. They're already on the fence with that. And then Poland, Greece, Hungary, and Italy, all these countries are not great in terms of the efficiency of their economies, in terms of the percentage of their GDP growth, in terms of their development in general. Greece is like one of the poorest European countries with constant economic crises. they seem, most of the people seem that those people are going to be an issue because we don't have the resources to handle that. This is the peak of the crisis, 2006. After some years, um, the situation would be absolutely different, right? The polls would be quite different, and the positions of these countries would change drastically because these countries have basically made sure that they're not part of it, aside from Italy, because the Italy has been a designated fall guy by the European authorities. So Poland, Greece, and Hungary would be showing the lowest percent in terms of the opinion that these people are going to be a problem. They're going to be the most tolerant ones. So basically, the countries that have restricted the access of these migrants to them are now having a very positive opinion, much more positive than before. However, countries like UK, France, Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden that have been quite, more on the tolerant side are now absolutely the opposite from that. The majority of people there do believe that immigrants are a problem. So that this is the effect of the initial consequences of that migration policy. Um, so while affected by a tolerant stance on migrants and refugees, it eventually has produced counter um, counterintuitive results in changing the attitudes because of the consequences of this policy, changing it to something completely the opposite of the initial reaction. Um, Less than 50% of the immigrants in Europe in the post-war period were Muslim until Ukrainians and Russians chipped in. So right now, Muslims are, Muslims, by Muslims here, we mean not like Muslims from Central Asia. No, we mean Muslims from African, Middle East, right? The troubled countries of Middle East, and also Pakistan and Afghanistan. We also throw in that as well. Um, the rest of the people who come to European Union are actually from diverse backgrounds. Again, Ukrainians and Russians are also one of the biggest groups migrating to Europe right now, and they're white Christians. So yeah, right. It's not about Islamization. It's not about that sort of migrants. And you know that whoever whatever groups of migrants are entering right now, like Ukrainians, for instance, in Poland, are also getting shafted by this anti-immigration narratives because all of a sudden Ukrainians are a big problem for the Polish people who are starting to perceive them not as allies, not as friends in trouble, but as freeloaders and also a problem for their economy. In Spain, for instance, there's another example in Spain where one would assume that most immigrants would come from Muslim Morocco, and that's the largest entry point for all the Muslim immigrants. Still, the biggest group, the largest group of immigrants are Catholics from Latin America, right? Who look the same, who speak the same language, and are of the same religion. This is a result of deliberate Spanish governmental policy that invites Latin Americans to immigrate because their fluency in Spanish language, the similar culture background, including Catholic denomination, makes um, the perfect citizens to replenish the thinning population because it's not just the low birth rate, but also a depressing economy that makes young people go to Germany, Netherlands, and more economically sophisticated countries to pursue their career there, while the only people left would be old people, right? The pensioners and the people who are too old to go to other countries. Um, yeah, that's another way to do it. Um, some Europeans have come to see the new immigrants as undesirable and have campaigned for stricter immigration controls. This has becoming more and more of the case in the contemporary years, in the last couple of years. Governments have also attempted to discourage immigration in a variety of ways. The Spanish have been taking advertisements in Northwest Africa describing how illegal immigrants would be caught and deported, and then some decided to pay, right? Like Germany literally offers you several thousand euros if you relocate back to whatever you came from. Um, um, in some of the cases, the concept of multiculturalism has been directly questioned by leaders, like David Cameron has been doing that, and other leaders as well. In Europe, typically any far right or just rightist European leader would be right now criticizing this heavily, and particularly shifting the blame for the internal incohesions and issues, economic wise or any other problems, would be shifting the blame on migrants. Recently, a great tidal wave of immigrants swept Europe in 15 and 16, 2015, 2016, mostly Syrian refugees, but also a bunch of other people as well, including Africans. Um, and a lot of people have been coming from Greece and Turkey. However, that was, closed off. Romania and Hungary also were a floodgate, and they also closed off their borders. Um, and so by now we only have Spain, who, where people travel through African enclaves, Ceuta and Melilla, or Italy, where people typically travel by water. Because other countries of the EU adopted the rule that asylum seekers can only apply for the asylum in the country of entry. So this is why Italy and Spain suffer disproportionately. When countries like Austria went as far as to proclaim they will deport anybody who comes in, who wouldn't care about the international law, we have not agreed on that. And nothing has really happened to them, aside from not having a lot of Muslim refugees in their country. They're absolutely fine with that. They have the lowest amounts of those refugees living. Um, the largest numbers of asylum applications were received in Germany, quite clearly because Germany is an economic leader of the country, but also Sweden and Hungary. General European leaders displayed admirable compassion. Hungary in the first stages of the conflict when that was still allowed. In general, European leaders have displayed admirable compassion in the face of what rapidly became a refugee crisis, with the exception of Hungary, where they, Hungary is not a democracy. Orban is a dictator, and they decided to say, we're gonna, send anybody away. If you want to be an asylum seeker, be that somewhere else. Um, the flood of refugees also produced fear and resentment on the part of the Europeans. Governments were unable to assimilate so many migrants. Um, Getting enough and grasping enough jobs or finding enough opportunities for language courses or providing any proper housing. Cultural assimilation was not even remotely approached, making many refugees form up to societies of their own, living by the standards of their own former countries and their culture, with a new, quite pressing and quite uncomfortable conditions. Turned out into a whole political crisis in several countries, including Great Britain, with a desire to avoid the refugee crisis was one of the drivers of Brexit. But guess what? Even after leaving European Union, that didn't change anything, right? Maybe even worse, because some of the experts would say that British migration policies and the situation with immigrants is even worse than those in Europe to some extent. Um, And because of that, in a lot of cases, it is far right politicians um, that utilizing anti-immigrant and sometimes quite openly xenophobic policy, narratives publicly would be coming to power, would be raising, high up the ranks, up to the positions as high as the prime minister. For instance, in Italy, we have Meloni. Orban is very, is a particularly strong autocrat right now, thanks to his anti-immigrant mood. And in Austria, a coalition of right-wing parties was elected in government in the 2017 elections, thanks to the desire of people to, and how those ideas appeal to people. It's not completely clear that their anti-immigrant stance was the issue that propelled them to power, but it definitely helped. It really does help the ultra-right forces gain more popularity. Similarly, there was concern in France that the anti-immigrant and ultra-right Marine Le Pen, which is now on the trial and cannot really participate in the elections, would win the presidency, but Macron was ensured his victory. However, right now there's no understanding who could even remotely compete with the substitute of Marine Le Pen. He becomes a very influential politician right now, and it seems like we're going to have a right-wing politician governing France for the next anything from 4 to 8 years. Um, Similarly, Germany has had the rise of AfD. They're not in power as much as to nominate their prime minister, but they have gotten seats in the parliament, which is significant, and their popularity in East Germany is becoming quite significant. And we're talking about a far right, ultra right, almost Nazi style political party, AfD. Not advocate for racial purity yet, but rather radical anti-immigrant nationalism, especially aimed against Muslims. So you'd literally just copy the speeches of 1933 Nazis and just Take out the word Jew, put a Muslim in, you would have the narratives, or immigrant in, and you would have the narratives that are typically being propelled by the AfD supporters. This is AfD protests in Germany, right? Quite a lot of people, and quite diverse crowd as well. You see a lot of older people, but all of them horribly white and all of them horribly German. This is also ultra-right immigrant protests. Um, this is those protests in UK, similar narratives. Most of the people here would be males, however, right? I want to just point that out. Conflicts. What kind of conflicts does that bring? Europeans debating the relative value of immigration face two major issues: assimilation, or the lack of one in Europe, as we already understood, because there were so many things happening at once. There were so many migrants that it has been horribly mismanaged. So the assimilation was not even approached, right? There was no proper policy that would allow these people to assimilate. And also, tolerance and intolerance to migrants that is very significantly affected by the arising negative consequences and conflicts that keep happening because there's no assimilation. Culture conservatives question the relatively open migration policies of the EU. In their view, the policies threaten to destroy Europe's culture heritage and replace it with an alien religion and culture. While again, we watched, in the previous slide, we could observe that this is a very, very faulty argument, not even close to being true. Liberals, on the other hand, defend immigration fiercely, arguing that immigration is needed because it allows Europe to gain more hands on the deck, right? A lot more people to replenish the failing economy, thinning demographic pool, but also because it stands for a democratic political system that cherishes and favors and worships the humanitarian-oriented liberal ideas, right, which European Union is basically built on. The encounter between Islam and European culture involves many particular points of conflict. There's a language, there's cultural issues, and assimilation in general as a problem. All of them are sources of tension. While Europeans want the new immigrants to learn the language and adopt the rules and basically become like them, avoiding anything that reflects upon them as Muslims and, let's say, Syrians or anybody, any other nationality that they used to have. Um, while this is happening on the part of the Europeans, the immigrants themselves, poorly integrated immigrants, prefer to stick to their own communities where they speak their home language and abide by their culture and religious norms. And quite often we see that Europeans do not abide by those norms and ask themselves a question: why are you guys so weird, right? Why didn't you guys do something that we think a normal person is supposed to do? But not all of these points of contact have been points of conflict, to be fair. Both sides have had to accommodate to one another. For instance, Ford Motor Company in Cologne, Germany has created prayer areas for Muslims so that they can pray during the workday. Its factory lunchrooms observe Muslim dietary requirements and serve meals after sundown during the month of Ramadan, which is something that, as Muslims, guys, you probably know is, can be quite problematic. Um, Especially in the West-oriented facilities and institutions. The Austrian military also provides special foods for Muslim soldiers and areas for prayer. Muslim clerics are appointed chaplains alongside with their Christian counterparts. In turn, these Muslim soldiers who had refused to salute the Austrian flag were given permission by their chaplain to do so. Right? And all of a sudden that's not a problem anymore. So the possibility of middle ground accommodation exists, although there may be more glaring examples of conflict than cooperation. Because typically, yes, everybody speaks about conflict, nobody speaks about successful examples of cooperation. Laws and sex is another thing that we have to take in mind, because when we're talking about Europe, sexual freedoms have been there for quite a while. A male can dress or the way he wants, or female can dress the way she likes. They can identify as whatever gender or whatever identity, whatever sexual identity they might have. It will be okay for the most part. Um, and there would be no prosecution whatsoever, at least from the official on the official level. Um, so Muslims, of course, have absolutely different rules about sex, exposure of female body in public, and treatment of women in general, food, and even the use of money investment. Before all of these issues all of a sudden become the matters of heightened culture debate and some even say that Europe, with its sexual gender freedom, is probably the worst place for Muslims, for the conservative Muslims, to settle, especially coming from Syria and other very very conservative, religiously conservative Muslim countries. Um, this slide is just one of the things that would be that anti-immigrant supporters would claim is the problem with immigrants today, that they really want Sharia law, they want to change us, they don't want to live in Europe, they want to live in their own country, which they're bringing here to us, right? However, if you would look at these guys, there's about 7 of them. And the back, you already see like some people just observing this circus, right? There's this idiocy. However, the fact of the matter is, these guys don't represent modern Muslims, right? They have nothing to say that modern Muslims would support. Because modern Muslims are not radical, right? Most of the Muslims are quite peaceful, normal people, just like the Christians or Buddhists or anybody else out there. They don't want war, they don't want bloodshed, they don't want to indoctrinate people in their own religion. All they want is to live happily ever after, enjoy their life, their family, and not to be bothered and in a similar manner from the others. Um, but it does give, this sort of people, these sort of radicals, do give a carte blanche for the people who advocate against migrants and against Muslims. And it gets them a lot more opportunities to persuade others that they're right, which they obviously are not, but fear is a powerful tool. It has been said there's no better example of conflict than the differences between sex and gender in Europe, between the Europeans and the Muslim immigrants. Europeans who have become more and more committed to sexual liberation find it very hard to live alongside the people who have been having an age-old commitment to control sexuality, especially female sexuality, and limit the liberties of women. Islam requires females to be covered at all times in public, including their heads and in some cases faces. Some Muslim cultures, especially in Africa, practice female mutilation called female circumcision, which is horrible. Don't Google what that is. It is, if uh, if you're not easily shocked by this sort of things, then by all means. But I warned you. Um, these practices are outlawed in EU, but young girls are often subjected to that because their African parents bring them back home, do these procedures there, and then bring it back. It's not just about sexuality. Many Islam-based cultures are very radical to whether a woman can work or even get out of the house alone without her husband or son or father or brother, just a male figure. For Europe, which has had its own fair share of fight for gender equality, this seems unacceptable because it particularly endangers the things that people literally fought for so many years. Needless to say, this brings out the most tensions in European society. It would seem that in this situation there is no common ground, right? There's no middle ground approach, no place for accommodation or adaptation, because they're just too far away ideologically from one another. But for Muslims, female chastity before marriage is paramount. Any evidence that a woman has engaged in premarital sex can be devastating for the female's reputation, prospects of marriage, and reputation of the family, and result in even worse consequences such as beatings, organized rape, or even murder. Like the guys from Chechnya can tell you all about that. It's called the murder of honor. A possible solution to these issues, to these radical principles of culture and religious, is the principle of religious toleration. However, again, we need to understand what can we tolerate and what we should not tolerate here. Quite known to Europeans since 1649 in Westphalian treaties, they helped end religious wars. It can also work both towards Muslims and non-Muslim population today. Um, uh, this has to be on the both sides, however. Europeans have to respect religious Muslims, while Muslims also have to respect non-Muslims' way of life, even if it's against their worldview. Because again, the arguments can go in either direction. European women can say Muslim women are constrained in their rights are taken away, and they're not free. But Muslim women can say, well, European women are not free from, let's say, objectivation of males, right? From a certain role that they also have fixed in the society. They can try to find it, but still, right? It's still a certain role. So that can work both ways. The conclusion here is pretty simple. Um, the toleration principle, not in the way that we have to accept something we don't believe in, right? Not something that we have to do in order to change our own worldview, but just quiet respect of different people, of difference, right? Something that countries like France doesn't do because again they take assumptions on the part of the people, on the part of the Muslims and Muslim girls, banning burqas, niqabs, and even hijabs in schools, universities, and on the Olympics, the most recent Olympics that they had. Sportswomen from Arab states that were covered in religious attire and were supposed to do that according to their own faith could not do that, but they're not even French citizens. How can you ban that? How can you ban that right for them, right? Um, so it has to be toleration. It has to be toleration in the sense that we retain our own principles and beliefs, but we respect somebody who doesn't have these, who has another opinion, right? Another culture, another way of life. Only then we can learn to bridge, slowly but steadily, be able to bridge the differences and find enough place for accommodation. Um, Conclusion here is very simple. The 21st century encounter of Europeans and immigrants has produced a great variety of cultural formations and responses, from the cultural hybrid of Creole Amsterdam to the cultural extremes of the debate over Islam in Europe. It has created a real dilemma with real consequences, political and economical consequences in Europe, on those who worry about preserving European heritage and those who are in favor of protecting international law, liberalism, and protection of human rights. Part of the reason the debate continues is that there seems to be few answers to the question of how Europe will remain Europe within its new, strongly multicultural model. However, again, one of the few things that we can take away out of this is that the problems with migration that Europe has today is not because Muslims are bad, not because these particular Muslims are bad, or these particular people of that ethnicity or nation are bad. It is because Europe has severely, and all of the countries of Europe have severely mishandled the issue of migration. They have not done proper political measures, they've not taken proper political steps to make it constructive. One of the biggest problems here is not that they come from a different country or a different culture or a different religion, is because that has been an uncontrolled migration, meaning that you don't understand who's coming to your country. Among those people, among the hundreds of thousands of people pouring into Europe each year, you will find at least a couple of thousands of people who are not supposed to go to your country. Rapists, murderers, violent people, people with questionable moral code, right? Who would immediately go join a local band if that would be profitable. This is not how migration should work. Out of humanitarian concerns, Europe has created um, a loophole which a lot of the bad people decided to abuse, and they do. And because of some of the bad people, the majority of the people who really were in need and managed to escape certain death or horrible conditions of life have to suffer now. And all because some people in high offices have mismanaged their job, their tasks, they horribly failed to properly tackle the issues with accommodation and assimilation. However, nobody wants to blame those politicians, and everybody wants to blame the people. This is your home task. We're going to discuss that next week. But also, what we are going to do is I will ask you instead of a lecture, because we sort of don't have any other classes to start a new topic. In addition to that, I would particularly do, that we will be uh, answering these questions with a lot more efficiency. We would have to watch this video. The two other videos you can watch on your own if you like, but this is something that you absolutely need to watch instead of a lecture, right? So you're not going to have a normal lecture, you're going to have this video. And normally in offline classes, this is what we would do, right? We just put up this video, we would watch it instead of the lecture, because again, nothing more to discuss, no more classes to discuss anything else. It is on how Denmark took a hard line on immigrants, and this is a sneak peek into the life of a country that's extremely wealthy, extremely well off, but doesn't know how to handle its own migration issues. It has taken a very radical stance, very anti-Muslim approach, and all of a sudden, for a country that has very few migrants, to be fair, not a lot, very few migrants um, have started to become a more unsustainable place for these people. And again, just make sure that you do that because there will be the information from this video will appear on your final. On that note, we're finishing with the topics that are dedicated to encounters uh, in history. Throughout this course, we've seen a variety of different examples of different cultures encountering one another, and results of that have led to hybridization, to the creation of something new and beautiful, sometimes to horrible consequences and despicable acts of humanitarian catastrophes, of horrible bloodshed. Uh, but then we see, in process, we see how new cultures, countries, and peoples and identities are being forged. Um, this is something that happens today through immigration. It doesn't have to be war, right? It doesn't have to be conquest. Through immigration, through contact, through trade, through people relocating, and the world becoming a more globalized place where you can, just get up, leave, and then work in another country for 10 years, then get up and leave and work yet in another country for another 10 years, bringing around your culture, but also taking portions of those cultures that you're surrounded by and spreading it onwards, right? So I hope, guys, that you have enjoyed this, at least the lectures. And I guess the next time we meet is going to be screen to screen during your discussion and then the final. So thank you for being here with me. Thank you for listening to this course. And goodbye. See you hopefully in some other course as well.